Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. This video is about Boris Nemtsov, whose anniversary was just on the 27th of February, just a few days ago. So, who was he, and why does his death matter? It was just over 5 years since he was murdered in Moscow, just within the shadow of the Kremlin, that complex of buildings in the middle of Moscow, which is synonymous with the Russian government. That's the official residence of President Putin. It contains cathedrals, museums, a concert hall, and so forth. So Boris Nemtsov was a politician. He'd been deputy prime minister of Russia for a few months in 1998. Back then, the deputy prime minister and the prime minister changed very often whenever Putin moved them in and out. And he was briefly spoken of as a possible president of Russia, Nemtsov. But anyway, it wasn't to be. So Nemtsov, he was born in Sochi, Russia in 1959, if memory serves. That's the very south of Russia, where the Olympic Games, the Winter Olympics, were held in 2014. So he was indigenous Russian on his father's side, Jewish on his mother's side, the side that counts, but he was baptized as a Christian, not brought up particularly religious. And indeed, anti-Semitism was one of the things that was used against him. So his mother was a doctor. I'm not sure about his father. He didn't grow up in a privileged family. Incidentally, there were doctors galore in the Soviet Union. Per capita, the highest number of doctors in the world, which is one of the few good things I've got to say about the USSR. So doctors were badly paid. So just because his mother had what we consider in the West to be a high status profession did not mean that they lived particularly well. But he was a very bright boy, very scholarly, and he got a PhD in physics. So he worked for the public sector. Everyone did in those days. There was no private sector. But he was someone who was fascinated with political ideas. He learned absolutely fluent English. He was, I suppose, everything that Putin is not. He was a man of integrity. He was courageous, physically courageous, indeed paid with his life for speaking up for the best interests of the Russian people. He was a man of attainments, academic attainments, and so on. And he was incorruptible. So he was someone who's really admirable and had an actual ideology. And in 1986, was gallant enough to lead protests in his city against setting up a nuclear power plant after the Chernobyl disaster. You might remember 1986 in Ukraine, a nuclear power plant exploded. Many people died as a result. Tens of thousands of children born within a 100-kilometer radius of it were born with severe congenital disorders as a result of that, because it was the fallout, the nuclear waste, and so on. And the radiation was just so high, so he didn't want another one of those in his town. And obviously, the Soviet Union had so much oil, gas, and coal, and yet they were using nuclear energy, which they could have easily avoided doing. And the Soviet government would just never admit to mistakes, never solve the problem, never tell the public the truth, just huge-scale lying. All right. Accidents happen all over the world, but in a free country, you investigate, you get to the bottom of it, people are held to account, you put in place measures to try and prevent it happening again, things like that. The Soviet Union was obviously the opposite, but people just trying to protect their back, who are higher up the chain of command. So in the 90s, Nemtsov, well, he was involved in various business ventures and in politics, and he was proud to call himself a liberal. And liberal wasn't a dirty word in 1990s Russia. The Soviet Union broke up because some people thought, let's have a genuine democracy. Let's have an independent judiciary. Let's have the rule of law. Let's have genuine elections and freedom of expression. And they briefly had some of that, but was quickly undermined. But that was associated with economic implosion. Such terrible social dislocation, defeat, fighting in Chechnya, and obviously bandit capitalism, when auctions were rigged by gangsters and people in the security services, and often they were the same people in the FSB, the Federal Security Service, or actually moonlighting as thugs, and Putin was involved in all of this, and that's why the public was hugely ripped off, and people weren't paid for months on time, and soon, included judges who were then susceptible to bribery, and employers didn't pay their employees for months on time, and anyway, there was just such a meltdown. So people began to associate democracy with this terrible hardship. But however bad the 90s was, it was heavenly compared to what they'd been through in the 1930s, say, to obviously man-made famines, the Soviet government deliberately starving millions of its people to death. How many people died of malnutrition in Russia in the 90s? I don't know. It might be none. If it was some, it was very, very few. And the state was not sending millions of people to labor camps, and the state was not executing tens of thousands of people every year. Indeed, they declared a moratorium on the death penalty, and that's been there ever since. They just assassinate people rather than actually judicially execute them these days. I'm not sure that's a step forward, but it's not a huge number anyway. So Boris Nemtsov said, well, we should do this properly and obviously pay people and also slim down the military. No more conscription, no more unnecessary wars. We don't need to be a military superpower. Let's just provide people with decent public services. And saw there was all this capital flight, and saw that some of the securocrats, Putin and his cronies, that they had teamed up with some of the most rapacious oligarchs. So it was quite regressive. They were going back to, I suppose, some sort of capitalist, militarist, hyper-nationalist dictatorship, people using chauvinistic rhetoric. And he was saying, no, let's not have that. Let's not have people ripping off the treasury. So he was briefly appointed deputy PM, as I said. He was a member of the Union of Right Forces, various other political parties. He was elected to Parliament for a while, and indeed he met Putin on one occasion. Probably one of the things that really irked Putin about him is this guy was tall, and Putin's about 5'6". You'll notice that people he appoints to high positions are quite often shorter than him, which is difficult to find someone who's shorter than him. For instance, Medvedev, but I think the new Prime Minister, Mishutin, is not, but he's not much taller than him. I mean, I met, well, one of the provincial governors of Tatarstan, president of Tatarstan, I should say, who was a very short man indeed. So that's an immense advantage in politics in Russia, and ideally from St. Petersburg. If you're not born there, to grown up there, Putin's hometown, whereas this chap Nemtsov was from the opposite end of the country. So anyway, his Jewish mother was used against him, and there was a slogan by anti-Nemtsov protesters: "Make Zionists into soap." Just because he was Jewish, that doesn't mean he was Zionist. He never became an Israeli citizen. I'm not aware that he ever even visited Israel, or an obvious reference to what would happen to Jewish people at the hands of the Nazis. So nice. Russian hyper-nationalists really paying some sort of compliment to supposedly their deadly foes, the Nazis, just because they're also anti-Semitic. Not suggesting most Russians are anti-Semitic. Anyway, so things kind of went wrong for him in the noughties, when obviously Putin was president, and Putin clamped down the free press, and Nemtsov spoke out about this, because so the free media was stealthily got rid of. And now almost every large media outlet is state-owned, either directly or indirectly. Might be a newspaper owned by a company and 60% of the shares are state-owned or something like that. And so no independent television channels. So it's really just pumping out Putin propaganda. So being a Kremlin mouthpiece and fomenting these lies, putting it about that coronavirus was invented by the United States and deliberately spread by them and things like that. So Nemtsov became very disillusioned with the way things were going, with the way democracy had been degraded, and the increasingly brazen behavior of Putin's clique. Cronies not just ripping off the public, starting these wars of aggression, deliberately killing hundreds of Russian civilians in apartment block bombings in 1999 to start a completely unnecessary conflict in Chechnya, propping up this monstrous tyrant in Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, and so on. Disappearing people, using torture on quite a wide scale, poisoning people at home and abroad, and then just splurging huge amounts of money on military hardware, which is not needed. The United States and NATO doesn't want to invade Russia, right? They don't want to take it over. Why would they? It's a basket case, not wanting to be rude. Because also oil, it's always cheaper to buy oil than to fight for it. I can't think of a single war which has been financed by conquering oil-rich areas. Another thing is, if NATO really wanted to take over Russia, they could have bought it in the 90s. When soldiers hadn't been paid for 6 months, they could have just bought it. Okay, so even some of the top generals just not paid, and they were very open to bribery in those days, and likewise the security services. So anyway, Nemtsov, he was really a dissident for the last 10 years of his life, fearlessly protesting, and the Russian constitution was more honored in the breach than in the observance. The Russian constitution, which specifically prohibits censorship, that came in, passing laws against so-called extremism, as though that's not censorship. It is. That's extremist to say that you can't express your opinion. But when I opine that's not extremist, I don't know how do we define that? You can't tell the truth. I mean, you can't say that certain Red Army soldiers committed rape in Germany in 1945. I'm not suggesting it was most Red Army soldiers, and I do homage to the incomparable gallantry of the Red Army in defeating the Third Reich, but it's still true that some of them committed crimes against women. All right, rape has been committed probably by soldiers of every army there is, including the army of my country. I don't think on a great scale. I could be wrong, but that's the plain truth. You can't tell the plain truth despite an absolute mountain of evidence proving this to be true, and loads of things that you're not allowed to say these days. And so there used to be regular protests in Mayakovskaya Square in Moscow, trying to uphold that article of the Constitution which guaranteed the right to protest, and people were shut down. I've seen footage of this woman pleading with the police saying, we have a constitutional right which guarantees us that we are permitted to protest, and yet they're being pushed around by the police and arrested for an unsanctioned protest. We don't need police permission, but if you don't get police permission, you'll be arrested. And the only party which gets permission regularly to protest is the Communist Party, because Putin likes to play to the gallery and pretend to be nostalgic about communism, despite the fact he certainly doesn't live like a communist. He lives like a particularly avaricious capitalist. So Nemtsov, he spoke absolutely fluent English. He traveled abroad quite a lot. He'd been awarded so many medals in Russia for his public service in the 90s, but by the Putin era, it was really all over. And he spoke out, and he unwaveringly denounced the war of aggression against Ukraine, calling it what it was, saying we've invaded Ukraine, which has never done us any harm. We've no need to attack Ukraine. We're the vastest landmass in the world. We don't need more land. Obviously, what Russia needs is decent public services, is to get the super rich to pay their fair share of taxes, and to diversify the economy, to not be so dependent on hydrocarbons, not to squander staggering sums of money on the latest generation of nuclear missiles and things like that, the ideally which will never be used, just boys' toys. It's just chauvinism, my one's bigger than your one, is to try and cope with Putin's small man syndrome. And I know the United States and other countries are at the same game, but Russia's one of the worst of these, because some of them are still smarting from the humiliation of the 90s, and they can't cope with the fact that they're actually not that important anymore. That say only about 4% of the world's population speak Russian, even badly, when it would have been, say, 10% in the 1980s of the world's populations could speak Russian. So they think, well, what can we beat the United States on? Well, we can beat them on maybe having more nuclear warheads, or maybe doping our athletes more so we win more Winter Olympic medals or something like that. So Nemtsov said, Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the government is lying and lying and lying about that. And again, he published document after document, just so much evidence proving it's true. So many Russian soldiers have been killed, brought back for burial, funerals announced in the local press, the Union of Russian Soldiers Mothers Committee speaking out, social media posts. There's just a superabundance of evidence proving it beyond a penumbra of doubt. The Russian army is in Ukraine, just like when Russia invaded and sequestered Crimea, and the Kremlin lied and lied and lied about it in public incessantly for days before suddenly saying, yes, they are our men. So why on earth would you believe anything that the Kremlin has to say, despite the fact they've told the most bare-faced lies on this very same issue? And Nemtsov courageously exposed how some of the pro-Russian rebels with their Buk missile had shot down that Malaysian airline flight in, I think it was 2014. Now, I'm pretty sure it was an accident. He thought it was an accident too, but they still shot it down and still lied about it. And again, there's ample evidence to prove that this is the case. So he was publishing documents proving this and saying, well, let's end this senseless war and let's just not take over this land. Let's not risk Third World War and all the rest of it, and let's solve actual problems instead of inventing new ones. So Putin, to distract people from kleptocracy and economic stagnation, was going to start this completely avoidable war, this foreign adventure to conquer land that they totally don't need. Obviously, you can see this as an existential threat, that there are free countries in this border where people don't live in fear of the government, where people can say what they want, can do what they want, can go where they want, and there are fair court decisions. In Russia, the acquittal rate is something like 0.3%. Anyway, so Boris Nemtsov, he rightly feared for his life and thought that Putin might have him murdered, as quite a few dissidents have been killed under Putin. Sure enough, on the 27th of February, 2015, Nemtsov was shot dead in the center of Moscow, just outside the Kremlin. I've walked past the place where he was killed many times. There's a makeshift shrine. The authorities have refused to put a plaque up there, despite this man having been Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. So people leave candles and flowers, and there's a vigil 24 hours because the police will often come and take it away. And if you have more than one person standing there, that could be seen as a protest, and without permission, that can be jail time for unsanctioned protests. So really, people just don't have rights, not allowed to demonstrate. I suppose that's one of the fundamental differences, is a lot of people there unfortunately not believing in freedom. Obviously, there are Russians who would like freedom like anybody else, to be able to say what they want, to hold the government to account, to have fair trials, not to be sent to prison without good reason, not to be conscripted into the army and severely beaten up by officers or indeed driven to suicide, and things like that, not to be paying tax when the super rich don't, and not to have their money wasted on weapon systems that are totally unnecessary when things that are necessary are not spent on. Like, it's reading about 30% of Russian hospitals not having heating. This is a country that can be -25 quite easily. That could kill people. So it's all very tristful, and it could all be so different, could be so much better. So Nemtsov gave his life in speaking up for peace and for liberty, for saying, well, let's not start a war against Ukraine. We'll actually have a Russia without Putin, without obviously the oligarchy and so on. So 5 men were found guilty of the murder of Boris Nemtsov, and they'd been paid $250,000 in toto, not individually, to kill him. And so $50,000 each is a huge sum of money in Russia. These are all Chechen men. Chechnya is a ethnic minority area of southern Russia. The Chechens have got their own language, they're Muslims and so on. They'd been appallingly treated by the Soviet government, sent off to Kazakhstan. Huge numbers of them died in the journey, and so into exile, not allowed back to their homeland for over 40 years. So some of them rebelled in the 90s, trying to get independence, but they were defeated. But anyway, some of these Chechens had agreed to carry out this hit for this money. They'd been released early from prison from long prison sentences. So that was that. They killed him. I don't think anyone disputes that these men did actually kill him. But who paid them the money? Who was ultimately behind them? That's never been disclosed. So there we go. Boris Nemtsov, obviously Russia would have been an awful lot better off under him, who actually wanted the best for his people and not particularly for himself. He could have played along with the oligarchy. He could have got rich. He could have been alive. He could have lived in great comfort. But he chose not to do that because he was valiant. Because he indefatigably spoke up for the common man, for a better life for ordinary people in Russia and Ukraine, and no more wars of aggression, no more oppression. But sadly, unfreedom has won, and I don't see any chance of this ending anytime soon. So that's Putin, the sawdust. Stalin is still there. Now, Putin is 100 times milder than Stalin, let's be fair. But partly because they've got other methods of control, and it's due to perhaps not to such a brutal era. All right, so I'm signing off now. So please book online lessons with me in English literature, English as a foreign language, history, politics, religious studies, geography, French, law, and choose me as your tour guide in London. Follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. And thank you so much for donations on Patreon and on PayPal. GeorgeCallahan79@gmail.com. Toodaloo.